At this point, I would like to introduce Publius, well-known expert on the Constitution and especially Article 5 and constitutional conventions. Publius, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. What's really behind the push for an Article 5 convention? To limit government power? Or to get a new constitution? James Madison, father of our Constitution, trembled at the prospect of an Article 5 convention because he understood that a convention gives the enemies of our Constitution the opportunity to get rid of it and impose a new one. Article 5 of our Constitution provides two methods of amending it. Congress proposes amendments or calls a convention to propose amendments if 2/3 of the states apply for it. The first method was used for the existing 27 amendments. Congress proposed them and sent them to the states for ratification. Under the second method, Congress calls a convention. We've never had a convention under Article 5. They are dangerous, and James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, 4 U.S. Supreme Court justices, among others, warned against it. But factions who want a new constitution have been pushing for a convention for 60 years, ever since the Ford Foundation produced the Constitution for the New States of America. Read this and tremble for your country. In the past, conservatives defeated the periodic pushes for a convention. So the convention lobby changed clothes and changed tactics. Now they are marketing a convention to appeal to conservatives. They are saying the only way to rein in the federal government is to amend our Constitution, and we can only get the amendments to do that at an Article 5 convention. So let's look at the Constitution they say must be amended to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. When we ratified our Constitution, we created a new government, a federation of sovereign states united under a national government only for the limited purposes enumerated in the Constitution, with all other powers reserved by the states or the people. We listed every power we delegated to the national federal government. Most of the powers are listed at Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 16. All our Constitution authorizes the federal government to do over the country at large falls into 4 categories. 1, military defense, international commerce and relations. 2, immigration and naturalization. 3, establish a commercial system with uniform weights and measures, patents and copyrights, a money system based on gold and silver, bankruptcy laws, mail delivery and some road building, and 4, with some of the amendments, secure certain civil rights. That's it. All other powers are reserved by the states or the people. This chart, and I have a handout sheet for you, lists the powers delegated to the federal government. It's a short list. It's only with respect to the enumerated powers listed in the Constitution that the federal government has lawful authority. If it's on the list, Congress may make laws about it. But if it's not on the list, Congress usurps power and acts unlawfully when it meddles. Yeah. So, why did the federal government turn into Frankenstein? Everybody ignores the Constitution. Ignorance, along with the collapse of morality, religion, and personal responsibility, has brought us to the brink of destruction. Because we didn't know the enumerated powers, the federal government was able to usurp thousands of powers not delegated. State and local governments collaborated with the usurpations by taking federal funds to implement unconstitutional federal programs. To claim these problems can be fixed by amending our Constitution makes as much sense as saying that since people violate the Ten Commandments, God should amend the Ten Commandments. But the Convention of States Project, COSP, insists the problem is the Constitution, and we have to amend our Constitution to make the federal government obey it. They say amendments will limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. But our Constitution already limits the power and jurisdiction of the federal government to those few and defined powers listed in the Constitution. So the claim that we can control those who ignore the Constitution by amending the Constitution is absurd. Mark Levin and Michael Ferris are aggressive promoters of COSP. They say they want amendments to limit federal power. So let's look at some amendments they proposed. Michael Ferris's Parental Rights Amendment delegates power over children to the federal government. Section 3 says, "Neither the United States nor any state shall infringe these rights without demonstrating that its governmental interest as applied to the person, your children and grandchildren, is of the highest order and not otherwise served." Mark Levin's so-called liberty amendments also do the opposite of what he claims. His amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes what are now unconstitutional federal agencies: education, energy, agriculture, environmental protection, etc., etc., etc. Our Constitution doesn't authorize these agencies. They are not on the list. But Levin's amendment legalizes all such agencies for as long as Congress reauthorizes them. Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution says only Congress may make laws. But since Woodrow Wilson, federal agencies have been writing rules, the Code of Federal Regulations. All these rules are unconstitutional as outside the scope of powers delegated and as in violation of Article 1, Section 1. But Levin's amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes these rules and the rulemaking process for as long as Congress approves them. Levin's amendment to limit federal spending is also phony. Our Constitution limits federal spending to the enumerated powers. If you go through the Constitution and highlight all the powers delegated to Congress and to the President, you will have a complete list of the objects on which Congress is authorized to spend money. That's how our Constitution controls federal spending, but everyone ignores it. Levin's amendment substitutes a budget for the enumerated powers and thus legalizes the current practice where Congress spends money on whatever is put into the budget. His amendment thus changes the constitutional standard for spending from whether the object is an enumerated power and creates a completely new constitutional authority to spend on whatever Congress or the President want to spend on. It thus transforms the Constitution from one of enumerated powers only to one of general and unlimited powers. And while his amendment pretends to impose a limit on the amount of spending, the limit is fictitious because it can be waived whenever Congress votes to waive it. During September 2016, COSP staged a 3-day simulated convention at Williamsburg, Virginia, to prove that at a convention called by Congress under Article 5, the delegates would not write a new constitution, but would come up with wise amendments to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And they came up with 6 proposed amendments. 1 for term limits. Here are the others. 1 would make Congress's existing practice of spending on whatever they want constitutional for as long as Congress continues to approve increases in the national debt. Another would delegate to the federal government dictatorial new powers such as I witnessed over 40 years ago in communist East Europe and the Soviet Union. It delegates to the federal government power over the movement or transportation of persons across state lines. This would provide constitutional authority for the federal government to do such things as require prior approval to cross state lines, require internal passports as in the Soviet Union, establish checkpoints at state borders, and ban the use of privately owned vehicles to cross state lines. Under Article 1, Section 1, only Congress may make law. But one amendment would elevate to law every order or dictate issued by anyone in the executive branch of the federal government. Another would authorize Congress to impose a national sales tax and a national value-added tax. And one would, like Mark Levin, legalize the unconstitutional regulatory administrative law state. The delegates to this simulated convention were primarily Republican state legislators handpicked by COSP, and they showed they are constitutionally illiterate, didn't understand what they are doing, and were steered by persons of insidious views who were present at the simulated convention. The delegates from Georgia were Representatives Timothy Barr, Buzz Brockway, and Bruce Williamson, and they voted for 4 of the 6 amendments. I have a flyer on this for you to take with you. So, would these amendments limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government? No, they do the opposite. They delegate new powers and legalize powers the feds have already usurped. No amendment can fix violations of our Constitution. When the feds usurp powers not delegated, they are ignoring the existing limitations on their powers. So the claim that we can get amendments to rein in the power and jurisdiction of the federal government is a huge con game. There is another agenda. COSP says, we must amend the Constitution because people in Washington don't understand it. Rubbish. Our Constitution is so simple. Alexander Hamilton said, the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. If it's on the list, the feds may do it. But if it's not on the list, they can't lawfully do it. For clauses the Supreme Court perverted, interstate commerce, general welfare, and necessary and proper clauses, we don't need a convention to draft amendments showing what these clauses mean. Just look it up in the Federalist Papers, but I've already done it on one page, and you can have a copy. COSP's whole case is based on a fabricated George Mason quote. They claim the convention method was added to Article 5 so that when the federal government violates the limits in the Constitution, the states could fix it by amending the Constitution. James Madison kept a journal at the Federal Convention of 1787. I went through it, every page, and pulled out every reference to what became Article 5. None of the delegates said that when the federal government violates the Constitution, the remedy is to amend the Constitution. They weren't silly men. Madison's journal shows that the framers agreed that the purpose of amendments is to remedy defects in the Constitution. And on June the 11th, 1787, George Mason said, the Constitution now being formed will certainly be defective, as the Articles of Confederation have been found to be. Amendments, therefore, will be necessary. So they discussed procedures for making amendments. The Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution, provided for amendments to be approved by the Continental Congress and all of the states. So, should the new Constitution, this one, also require Congress to propose amendments? Mason said that would be improper because Congress may refuse consent to the amendments people want. So, this Constitution doesn't require Congress to approve amendments. So, why was the convention method added to Article 5? Madison wanted Congress to propose the amendments on their own or at the request of the states. But Mason said the people should be able to propose amendments without asking Congress to propose them. He wanted the convention method added. Now listen carefully. Madison knew that our Declaration of Independence says that the people have the self-evident right to throw off their government and set up a new one, and thus have the right to meet and draft a new Constitution, whether the convention method were in the Constitution or not. So the convention method was added to Article 5, and it provided a way for the people to propose amendments. But it also provided a way to get a new Constitution under the pretext of just getting amendments. You follow me?
Yeah.
The anti-federalists wanted another convention so they could get rid of the Constitution the delegates had just drafted. On August the 31st, 1787, George Mason said he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands, and if it weren't changed to suit his views, he wanted another convention. So, even before this Constitution was ratified, the Anti-Federalists were agitating for another convention to get rid of it. And that's why, as early as April 1788, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison began warning against another convention. COSP claims Congress has nothing to do with the convention except name the time and place of the initial meeting. They say state legislatures will run the whole show. But that's not in Article 5. COSP made it up. And COSP's false claim violates the Constitution. Article 5 says Congress calls the convention, and Article 1, Section 8, last clause, delegates to Congress the power to make the laws necessary and proper to carry out its power to call the convention. So any pretended laws made by state legislatures which contradict these provisions of the U.S. Constitution are unconstitutional and fall under the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2. The April 2014 report of the Congressional Research Service shows that Congress understands that Article 5 delegates to Congress exclusive authority over setting up the convention, and in Congress's preparations for Article 5 conventions in the past, Congress has claimed power to decide how to count the applications, to determine the number and selection process for delegates, to determine whether each state will have one vote or the same number of votes as their electoral votes. So if Congress permits the states to select delegates or send delegates, Georgia could get 16 delegates in votes, and California would get 55. COSP also claims that delegates at the convention have no power to do anything except rubber stamp decisions made by state legislatures. But that also is not in Article 5. COSP made that up too. An Article 5 convention is a federal convention called by the federal government to perform the federal function of addressing our federal Constitution. And Article 5 shows that the convention is the deliberative body. Article 5 doesn't grant to the states any power to control delegates. The only power the states have is to ask Congress to call a convention. Once 2/3 of the states have applied, it's out of the states' hands. COSP claims to know exactly how a convention is going to operate, but page 27 of the CRS report says, in the final analysis, the question, what sort of convention, is not likely to be resolved unless or until the 34-state threshold has been crossed and a convention assembles. So we'll have to get a convention before we know how it is going to operate. But COSP says a convention is safe because 3/4 of the states have to ratify whatever comes out. That's not true. Our Declaration of Independence recognizes the right of the people to alter or abolish their form of government and set up a new government. We invoked that right in 1776 to throw off the British monarchy. In 1787, we threw off our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and we set up a new constitution, this one which created a new government. How did we get from our first constitution to our second constitution? There was a convention called to propose amendments to our first constitution. The Continental Congress resolved on February the 21st, 1787, to call a convention to be held in Philadelphia, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, end quote. But the delegates ignored this limitation from the Congress, and they ignored the instructions from their states, and they wrote our second Constitution. And in Federalist Paper number 40, James Madison invoked that transcendent and precious right of a people to throw off one government and set up a new one as justification for ignoring their instructions and writing a new constitution. You can't stop that from happening at another convention. If we have a convention now, George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton won't be there. Who will be there? Constitutionally illiterate people such as those who attended the simulated convention and persons of insidious views to steer them to the predetermined outcome, which is almost certainly a third constitution. A third constitution will have its own new mode of ratification. Our first constitution required the Continental Congress and all of the 13 states to ratify amendments. But our second constitution, drafted at the Amendments Convention of 1787, provided at Article 7 that it would require only 9 states for ratification. If we have a convention today, there is nothing to stop delegates from proposing a third constitution with its own new mode of ratification. The Constitution for the new states of America is ratified by a national referendum, a national popular vote. Under this Constitution, we are disarmed. Here is the proposed Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America. Yes, almost 100 pages. The Constitution 2020 movement is backed by George Soros, Eric Holder, Cass Sunstein, and Marxist law professors all over the country. They want a Marxist constitution in place by the year 2020. Do you know about the North American Union? Globalist George W. Bush met on his ranch with the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Mexico, and they sketched it out. The 3 countries basically merge, and a parliament is set up over them. This is the Taskforce report on the North American Union, sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations. Heidi Cruz was on the task force which wrote the report. The globalists want a new constitution to transform us from a sovereign nation to a member state in the North American Union, and they need a convention to get that new constitution. But COSP says not to worry because delegates can be controlled by faithful delegate laws. That's absurd. State legislatures and the Continental Congress couldn't control delegates to the Federal Amendments Convention of 1787, and they can't control delegates to a convention today. It is the power of a free people to form, modify, or abolish their government. An Article 5 convention is a sovereign assembly with government-making or government-changing authority. The delegates would be the sovereign representatives of the people, or in our venal times, they would be doing the will of the big money globalists who want the convention. Congress is merely a creature of the federal Constitution, and state legislatures are merely creatures of their state constitutions. Creatures of constitutions can't dictate the terms of constitutions. This was discussed at length in Madison's journal entry for July the 23rd, 1787. So the delegates can, like James Madison in Federalist Number 40, invoke that right recognized in our Declaration of Independence to throw off the state and federal governments we have and write a new constitution which creates a new system of government. And since it will have its own new mode of ratification, it's sure to be approved. This is why the brilliant men warned against an Article 5 convention. During April 1788, our future Chief Justice John Jay wrote that another convention would run an extravagant risk. In Federalist Number 49, James Madison shows that a convention is neither proper nor effective to restrain government when it encroaches. In his November the 2nd, 1788 letter to Tuberville, Madison said he trembled at the prospect of a second convention, and if there were an Article 5 convention, the most violent partisans and individuals of insidious views would strive to be delegates and would have a dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric of our country. In Federalist Number 85, Hamilton said he dreads the consequences of another convention because the enemies of our Constitution want to get rid of it. Justice Arthur Goldberg said in his 1986 editorial in the Miami Herald that it cannot be denied that the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 broke every restraint intended to limit its power and agenda, and any attempt at limiting the agenda at an Article 5 convention would almost certainly be unenforceable. Chief Justice Warren Burger said in his June 1988 letter to Phyllis Schlafly, "There is no effective way to limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda." Justice Scalia said on April the 17th, 2014, "I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa, who knows what would come out of that?" And the Federal Convention of 1787 and the Declaration of Independence show us that delegates can't be controlled. Are there violent partisans and individuals of insidious views among us today? Yes, and they want a convention. But the convention lobby says only moral and wise people will be delegates. Let's look at that claim. There are 3 ways to select delegates: Congress, Do you trust Congress to appoint moral and wise people? They could appoint Nancy Pelosi as chair and AOC as a delegate. State legislatures, will they appoint moral and wise delegates? Popular election. Will the people select moral and wise delegates? Moral and wise people haven't been in charge of anything in this country for 100 years. COSP trots out celebrities with no expertise in our Constitution to endorse an Article 5 convention. The convention lobby has been able to mislead these celebrities and others because they don't know that our Constitution already limits the federal government to the enumerated powers. Because they don't know, they can be manipulated to believe that the Constitution is the problem. But amendments don't control governments which already ignore the Constitution. The First Amendment didn't stop them from banning Christian speech in the public square. The Second Amendment didn't stop them from restricting guns and ammo. The Fourth Amendment didn't stop them from spying on us without a warrant. The Fifth Amendment didn't stop them from uncompensated regulatory takings. And the 10th Amendment didn't stop them from usurping thousands of other powers. And now federal spending. The Pew report says that for fiscal year 2016, 34.3% of the revenue the Georgia state government got was from federal funds. And that's a pittance compared with the additional federal money sent into Georgia for local governments, non-governmental organizations, research grants, price supports, food stamps, rent subsidies, free phones, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, etc., etc., etc. As rational people, we cannot rant and rave about how we need a balanced budget amendment to rein in federal spending when we have our hands out for all that federal money. And all that money, and the money sent to the other 49 states, year in and year out, decade after decade, is added to the national debt. And all that spending is unconstitutional. So what do we do? First, Thomas Jefferson said, you cannot be ignorant and free. We better learn and enforce these. Second, don't go along with the lawlessness. 220 years ago, Kentucky and Virginia showed the country how to deal with federal usurpations when they passed the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. James Madison drafted the Virginia resolutions. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Kentucky resolutions. He said, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Nullification, the refusal to submit to unconstitutional acts, is the remedy our framers advised when the federal government violates the Constitution. During 2014, the Georgia legislature sent 2 applications to Congress asking Congress to call a convention. This year, the term limits lobby wants Georgia to send still another application to Congress. We must educate Georgia legislatures so they'll rescind Georgia's existing applications and not pass any more. So what's the push for a convention really about? We know Our Constitution already limits the federal government to the enumerated powers. We know that everyone has ignored our Constitution for 100 years. We know that the proposed amendments increase the powers of the federal government. We know that amendments can't control governments which ignore the Constitution. We know delegates can't be controlled. We know a new constitution can be imposed. We know that new constitutions are already prepared. Our Constitution is preventing the political integration of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. I suggest the globalists want a convention so they can complete their coup against us and get a new constitution which transforms us from a sovereign nation to a member state of the North American Union. This is a new war. It isn't between Democrats and Republicans. It isn't between liberals and conservatives. This is between the globalists and those of us who want to preserve our Constitution and national sovereignty. I say, let's enforce these and downsize the federal government to its enumerated powers. And while we're at it, let's also downsize state governments. I'm old. And I remember when state governments were small. I thank the sponsors for this event, the Georgia Republican Assembly, the Madison Forum, and the Ackworth Friends of John Birch. Make sure you get copies of the flyers online so that you can click on the links. If you study the flyers, you will have a solid education on this issue, and you will be able to talk to anybody and amaze your friends and confuse and confound our enemies.